All right, everybody, now I'm going to move on to the second part of Module 8, which is on Chapter 9. So in Chapter 9, we are talking about thinking and then getting a little bit more specific and talking about intelligence and how to assess intelligence. So when we start talking about thought, we really need to consider the different elements of cognition and then also particular biases that we have. Kind of similar to what I just said a few minutes ago about memory, I think we really take our cognitive processes and thought processes for granted. We do not really ever pause and think about all of the fast decisions we have to make, or all the decisions we have to make using very little information. When you actually stop and think about it, it's incredible how quickly, how efficiently, and how effectively our brain makes decisions for us. So, for example, if we were in class together, I would point out that, each of the classrooms on our campus is very unique. Each classroom has a different setup, different types of chairs, different types of desks, and yet during a typical first week of the semester, you navigate all of those kind of novel and unique classrooms fairly easily and with very little thought. Just think about, some of the different setups in the different buildings. There are some buildings that have really weird desks and really weird chairs. I'm thinking of the HCC, those chairs that like spin like a top. If you've never sat in one of those, I highly recommend trying it. It will give you quite a thrill. But without ever seeing something like that, you look at that and you can maybe with a moment of pause say, I think that's a chair and I think I'm supposed to sit in it. The reason we can do that is we have these different aspects to our cognition that help us make these decisions. And so we're going to talk about concepts, prototypes, propositions, cognitive schemas, and mental images. So by a concept, I'm talking about mental categories. And categories are one of the main ways that our brain helps us navigate kind of the unknown. It also helps us organize things into kind of helpful ways to then retrieve information more efficiently and more effectively. So essentially, a concept or concepts are mental categories that group objects or activities or experiences based on some type of common properties. So looking here, you can see, these are 3 different types of dogs. Each of them have their own kind of unique aspects to them. They differ in the type of fur, the color of fur, the type of nose they have. Their ears look different, right? Their paws, there's lots of differences. But they all belong to the concept of dog. And so these different instances of the concept of dog help us, again, organize information in a way that then helps us make future decisions. And then also kind of relating back to we talk about with memory, it's a memory construct as well. It's a way of organizing information. Prototypes, kind of a similar concept, is that we're often confronted with things that have unique aspects to them. And so what we have is this prototype that is essentially a best case representation of a particular concept. So you have a prototype for dog in your mind. You have a prototype for bird. So for example, for this person, the prototype of a bird is this. Whereas she sees a turkey and she's considering, is that a bird? Does it match different characteristics of my prototype of bird? In what ways is it different? Is it different enough that maybe I'm looking at a different type of animal? And so these concepts and these prototypes help us better navigate life in terms of determining what we're looking at, if it's something we've never looked at before, or again, if it's something that pretty easily fits into the concepts that we've already developed for similar, again, activities or objects or relations. And so really what we're talking about is we're developing cognitive schemas. So cognitive schemas are kind of the broader umbrella term. So I included this figure here to kind of help you see that. So by a cognitive schema, I mean an integrated mental network of knowledge, beliefs, and expectations. It's kind of the mega web that we draw to identify the way that different concepts relate to each other or different propositions. So a proposition is where you take maybe multiple concepts or multiple ideas and create a unit of meaning. A mental image is a mental representation for something that maybe we experience or observe. And so essentially, again, what we're creating here is a mental or cognitive representation for the things happening around us. And so I think gender ideas or gender beliefs are kind of I think, a good example of this. So the cognitive schema would be essentially our beliefs about gender. And so within that, we have different concepts or different kind of units of meaning, or different kind of assumptions that we make or categories we create that help us understand different expectations for people based on their gender. And so as we create these different, again, kind of strings of ideas, then we're starting to get more complex propositions, which is where you maybe take multiple concepts and create, again, this unit of meaning. So an example of a proposition, let's just think of any of the stereotypes about gender, right? We think of women as very passive, men as more aggressive. We think of women as caregivers, and men are supposed to be the breadwinners, right? And so we're taking these individual concepts and creating a proposition. So one of the propositions could be, women are passive. And so from there, we're creating this integrated kind of web of knowledge or expectations, which create the cognitive schemas. So this is the way that our brain organizes information, because if we just had individual units or individual nuggets of information, our brain would not be able to make fast decisions. It would not make accurate decisions. Any little thing in life would stump us, and we would have to sit down and think through everything that we do, every decision we make, even, again, how to sit in a chair or how to use a desk. Whereas these cognitive schemas that consist of concepts, propositions, and mental images help us make fast and pretty effective decisions in day-to-day life. And so just to get a little more specific about how we really do solve problems or how we do make decisions, there's lots of little kind of shortcuts or approaches we can use. Sometimes we rely on an algorithm, which is simply a problem-solving strategy. If you kind of follow the step by steps, even if you're not thinking about it, even if it's something you've never done before, if you follow the algorithm, the outcome is pretty predictable, right? It should produce the expected outcome. So I think recipes are a great example of this. I am not good at cooking, but I can follow a recipe. And when I use that algorithm, the outcome is pretty effective. I don't always understand how I get there. Again, I know very little about cooking, but using the algorithm or the recipe, I'm able to get to the desired outcome. Sometimes we use a heuristic, which is just kind of a general rule of thumb. It doesn't necessarily guarantee an optimal solution because, again, it's kind of just loose guidelines. I think a really good example of this comes from clinical psychology. We have what we call evidence-based therapies, which is essentially what science has shown tends to work for particular disorders. So that means when I was practicing and seeing clients in therapy, what I would do is I would diagnose them, and then from that diagnosis, I would follow the heuristic of evidence-based treatment and kind of use it as a general rule of thumb of which treatment to choose. So for example, with depression, I know that cognitive behavioral therapy tends to be pretty effective. Does it guarantee it will be effective? Absolutely not. Not all patients respond well to it, but using that heuristic, that's where I would start as a kind of general rule of thumb. Sometimes we rely on insight, which is just that like random out of the blue aha moment. As a scientist, insight always makes me kind of nervous because it's like, well, how did we arrive there? The kind of process behind it is it's more unconscious. Kind of the same thing with intuition, which is just a gut feeling. For making decisions like where to go to dinner, great, intuition's awesome. But for making decisions that maybe have long-term impact, like what type of therapy to use for someone, intuition's probably not the best approach. We're probably better off using something like an algorithm or heuristic. Or even better yet, the kind of ultimate thing on this slide is dialectical reasoning, which is looking at the evidence. Let's look at the evidence pointing for or against something. Let's weigh it. Let's compare. Let's evaluate. I love the word evaluate, meaning let's actually critique and consider the points of view, that maybe are offering different options. So dialectical reasoning is, again, kind of the ultimate here, because it isn't just blindly following a recipe. It isn't just, following a general rule of thumb. It's not going for the aha moment. It's not going gut feeling. It's actually using what we would consider critical thinking. We do have to consider that there are barriers to reasoning, and these come up, I would say, daily for most of us. We probably don't even realize. One of them is we tend to exaggerate the improbable. That happens because we rely a lot on our emotions, or we rely on how easily we can think of examples. So, for example, when I'm at the beach, I'm almost always convinced I'm going to be attacked by a shark. I don't know why, right? I love the water. I've been at the beach a lot. I feel comfortable at the beach. But it's just this idea that I can think of a lot of examples of shark attacks, and it makes me think that the event is more likely than it really is. So that would be an example of exaggerating the improbable, specifically in this case because of the availability heuristic. The way we frame it also will impact the choice that we make. So for example, if we are proposing a problem, proposing a program to address a problem, if we're framing it in terms of lives saved, for this one, they're going to choose this first program. Whereas if we're framing it in terms of nobody dies, then they're going to choose this second program over here. So essentially what I'm trying to say is that the decision that we make will be based on the way that the problem or the choice is framed. Framing this solution in terms of saving lives will lead them to pick a different program than if we frame the options in terms of people dying. The fairness bias, this one always makes me laugh. So let's say that you're in a game scenario. Your partner in the game gets $20 and then has to decide how much to share with you. And then it's up to you. If you accept what they offer, then you guys get that amount. If you reject what they offer, neither of you get anything. It would make sense for you to accept anything they offer. Even if they offer you $1 of those $20, you now have $1 more than you had before. But what's so funny is people only will accept a certain amount. So if the offer gets too low, people reject it. And so that comes from the fairness bias. Hindsight bias is our our tendency, these are all tendencies, tendency to overestimate one's ability to predict something once you know the outcome. My favorite example of this is when somebody turns out to be like a serial killer or a mass shooter, and then they interview the neighbor. The neighbor always says, "I knew it all along." And I just laugh because that's hindsight bias. It's because you know the outcome, and it just feels more comforting to be able to say that you thought you knew all along. That feels more predictable. In actuality, if they knew, they would have called the police or taken some steps. Confirmation bias is super relevant right now because we are in election season. This is our tendency to only pay attention to things that confirm our own beliefs. If we hear something that maybe runs counter to our own beliefs, our own values, we tend to dismiss it or critique it in a way that it isn't going to take too much of an effect on how you believe or what you think. And so we just end up confirming our beliefs over and over. Mental sets, it's where we tend to solve problems using procedures that have worked in the past for similar issues. I see this a lot in students, like when they take my research methods class. What they see is that they solve one problem on a test using a particular strategy. They know they got it right. So then they try to use the same strategy to answer another question, even though a different approach is needed. So that's pretty common for students in different classes. So these are just all barriers to reasoning rationally. The good news is we can compensate and overcome for these different biases or again, kind of mental sets or heuristics that we get stuck in by, first of all, being aware of them. We know that being aware of our biases can help us identify them and reduce the impact of them on our decision making. If it's something that we're an expert in, or we know that there are like really significant personal consequences, we also tend to do a pretty good job of reducing the impact of these barriers. So I'm going to talk about intelligence in the last part of this video. I'm going to need a few more minutes because I'm going to run out of time. So I apologize. There will be a third part video talking about intelligence.